The storm over Aegis Field Private Terminal raged at midnight, sending sheets of cold rain slamming against the reinforced glass of Hangar 3. Garrett Vance, 36 years old and wearing oil-stained mechanic coveralls, wiped his greased hands with a shop rag. His muscles ached from a 16-hour double shift. As a senior line technician, he made $22 an hour, barely enough to cover the specialized medical therapy his 6-year-old daughter, Chloe, needed after the car accident that took her mother. In the corner of the dim hangar break room, Chloe sat quietly on a plastic chair, coloring a picture of a twin-engine jet with a purple crayon, her small legs swinging under the table. Garrett glanced at her, his rugged, tired face softening for a split second before the heavy steel doors of the hangar blasted open. Harrison Croft, a ruthless hedge fund billionaire known for buying out failing logistics firms and gutting them, marched into the hangar. He was flanked by two burly security detail operatives in matching dark suits. Trailing behind them was Lily Evans, a 23-year-old ground operations intern who looked terrified. Harrison was yelling, his voice cutting through the roar of the thunderstorm outside. He was furious that his private charter, a vintage customized Learjet, had been red-flagged and grounded by the maintenance crew due to a hydraulic microfracture. "I don't care about your safety protocols," Harrison snarled, spinning around to face Lily. He grabbed her tightly by the forearm, twisting her wrist slightly as she gasped in pain. "My board meeting in Chicago starts in 4 hours. If this bird isn't in the air in 10 minutes, I will personally see to it that you never work in aviation again, you useless little peasant." Lily trembled, tears welling in her eyes as she tried to pull away from his grip. "Please, Mr. Croft," the chief inspector flagged the left landing gear actuator. "It's unsafe for takeoff." Harrison tightened his grip, pulling her closer, his face twisted in arrogant rage. "I own the contract for this entire terminal. I say when it's safe." The corporate elite standing near the terminal entrance, including Victoria Sterling, the stunning but notoriously icy CEO of Sterling Global Aviation, watched the scene play out with detached indifference. In their world, employees were replaceable assets, and Harrison Croft was a client worth 9 figures. Victoria stood with her hands elegant inside her cashmere coat, her expression completely unreadable, though her 5-year-old son, Leo, clutched her hand, visibly frightened by the violence. Garrett Vance didn't care about 9-figure clients. He set his shop rag down on a tool chest. The movement was slow, deliberate, carrying the quiet, steady weight of a man who had faced down real danger in places the civilian world forgot. He stepped out of the break room, his work boots clicking rhythmically against the polished concrete floor. "Take your hand off her," Garrett said. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a hard, resonant authority that instantly cut through the tension in the room. Harrison paused, turning his head to look at the grease-stained mechanic approaching him. His security guards stepped forward, chests out, hands moving subtly inside their jackets. Harrison let out a mocking laugh. "And who the hell are you? A grease monkey telling me what to do. Get back to changing tires before I have you thrown out into the rain." Garrett didn't stop until he was exactly 2 feet away from the billionaire. He ignored the guards entirely, his dark eyes locking onto Harrison's fingers, which were still digging into Lily's bruised skin. "I won't ask you a second time," Garrett whispered. The sheer, unyielding masculinity radiating from him made Harrison's breath catch. One of the security guards stepped in, reaching out a heavy hand to slam into Garrett's chest. "Move back, pal." What happened next took less than 2 seconds. Garrett shifted his weight fractionally, intercepting the guard's wrist with his left hand. With a lightning-fast, precise rotational twist, he used the guard's own momentum against him. A sharp, muffled pop echoed through the hangar as the guard gasped, falling to his knees, his arm locked perfectly behind his back in an excruciatingly painful but non-lethal submission hold. Garrett's right hand simultaneously targeted the second guard, his fingers extended in a rigid strike that stopped millimeters from the man's throat, freezing him instantly. Garrett looked back at Harrison Croft, his face completely expressionless, his breathing perfectly regulated. "Let her go. Now." Terrified by the sudden display of lethal combat efficiency, Harrison released Lily's wrist, stumbling backward. Lily scrambled behind Garrett, trembling violently. "You're a dead man," Harrison hissed, pulling out his phone with shaking hands while his remaining guard helped the first one up from the concrete. "I'm calling the airport authority and the state police. You just assaulted my team. You're going to prison, and your little brat will be in the foster system by sunrise." Garrett stood his ground, completely unfazed, though his heart tightened at the mention of Chloe. From the shadows of the VIP lounge entrance, Victoria Sterling stared at the mechanic, her piercing blue eyes wide with an intense, uncharacteristic shock. She had never seen a common laborer command a room with such terrifying magnetic authority. But before anyone could speak, The high-pitched wail of airport security sirens began to echo down the tarmac, moving rapidly toward Hangar 3. The heavy steel doors of the hangar rattled as 3 airport security vehicles skidded to a halt on the wet tarmac outside, their flashing crimson and blue lights reflecting violently across the glossy concrete floor. Chief Jackson Briggs strode into Hangar 3, his hand resting firmly on his utility belt, followed by 4 armed officers. The atmosphere instantly turned suffocating. "He's right there!" Harrison Croft roared, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at Garrett. "Arrest him immediately. This psychopath just assaulted my personal security detail. Look at my man's shoulder. I want him in chains, and I want his employment terminated by the time the police transport arrives." Chief Briggs looked at the first security guard, who was still groaning and nursing a dislocated joint, then looked at Garrett Vance. Garrett didn't move. He didn't reach for a weapon, nor did he put his hands up in surrender. He stood like a monolith, his posture relaxed but perfectly balanced, a shield between the trembling intern, Lily, and the anger of the wealthy men in the room. "Stand down, Vance," Chief Briggs warned, though his voice lacked conviction. He had known Garrett for 2 years as the quiet, reliable night shift mechanic who never complained and always fixed the unfixable. But Harrison Croft was a major donor to the city's aviation board. Influence always carried a heavy badge. Before Chief Briggs could step forward, a tiny voice broke through the tension. "Daddy?" Chloe stood at the entrance of the break room. She was clutching her drawing against her chest, her knuckles white. Her wide brown eyes looked at the flashing police lights, the uniform-clad officers, and the angry faces. A single tear rolled down her cheek, her small frame shivering in the damp hangar air. Garrett's entire demeanor transformed in a heartbeat. The lethal, razor-sharp edge that had terrified Harrison seconds ago vanished entirely, replaced by a profound, heartbreaking softness. He dropped to one knee, turning his back completely on the armed guards, a tactical risk no ordinary man would ever take, and extended his arms toward his daughter. "Come here, sweetheart," Garrett murmured. His voice was low, rich, and completely steady, acting like an anchor in the chaotic room. Chloe ran across the concrete, throwing her small arms around his neck. Garrett scooped her up effortlessly, pressing her head gently against his shoulder, shielding her eyes from the flashing lights. "It's okay, baby. Daddy's just finishing up some work. You're safe. I've got you." A few yards away, Victoria Sterling watched the embrace, a strange, tight sensation forming in her chest. As the CEO of Sterling Global Aviation, she was used to dealing with men of immense power, men who used their voice to dominate and their money to crush. Yet this man, wearing a grease-stained uniform, possessed a quiet masculinity that felt infinitely more powerful than anything she had ever bought. Suddenly, a loud crack of thunder boomed directly overhead, rattling the hangar's corrugated roof. The sudden violent noise caused Victoria's 5-year-old son, Leo, to let out a sharp shriek. He dropped his toy airplane, his face turning pale as he began to hyperventilate. Leo suffered from severe sensory processing issues, a condition Victoria spent millions trying to treat with top specialists, yet nothing seemed to work when the panic set in. "Leo, stop it," Victoria whispered sharply, her voice tightening as she tried to pull him against her cashmere coat. "Be quiet. Everyone is looking. You're fine." But her touch was tense, driven by the anxiety of maintaining her flawless public image in front of her high-profile clients and the police. Sensing his mother's rigid panic, Leo's crying escalated into a full-blown hysterical episode. He slipped out of her grip, dropping to the floor, covering his ears and screaming in pure terror. Victoria froze. The most powerful woman in American aviation, a ruthless negotiator who could silence an entire boardroom with a single glance, stood completely helpless, her hands trembling as her child spiraled out of control. Garrett looked up from Chloe. He saw the sheer vulnerability bleeding through Victoria's icy exterior. Without a word, he gently set Chloe down next to Lily. "Stay with Lily for a second, okay, Chloe?" Garrett walked past the stunned security guards and the scowling Harrison Croft. He walked directly toward the billionaire CEO and her screaming child. "Stay back, mechanic," Victoria warned defensively, her pride flaring even through her internal panic. Garrett ignored her warning. He dropped to his knees right in front of Leo, keeping his distance but sinking down to the boy's eye level. He didn't try to grab the child or hush him. Instead, Garrett began to clap his hands in a slow, rhythmic, hypnotic pattern, matching the precise frequency used by military survival instructors to ground panicked soldiers. "Look at me, buddy," Garrett said. His voice wasn't loud, but it held a warm, undeniable frequency of pure safety. "Breathe with me. Just count the claps. 1, 2, 3. Leo's screaming stuttered. He blinked through his tears, his small chest heaving as his eyes locked onto Garrett's calm, calloused hands. The steady rhythm seemed to cut through the sensory overload of the storm. Slowly, miraculously, the boy's breathing began to slow down. Within 60 seconds, Leo let out a long, shuddering sigh and reached out, wrapping his small, sticky fingers around Garrett's massive, grease-stained thumb. Victoria stared at the scene, her breath caught in her throat. She had spent a fortune on therapists, yet this man had calmed her son in a minute, using nothing but his presence. This is absurd. Harrison Croft interrupted, stepping forward to break the silence. I don't care about family hour. Chief Briggs, arrest this man now. And Victoria, your company manages this maintenance facility. I expect this lowlife fired immediately, or Sterling Global loses my entire corporate fleet contract. Victoria slowly stood up, her icy mask snapping back into place, though her hands were still slightly trembling. She looked at Harrison, then down at Garrett, who was gently helping Leo stand back up. She knew the financial impact of losing Croft's fleet would be devastating to her quarterly projections. Chief Briggs looked at Victoria, waiting for her command, since her family owned the tarmac. Mr. Vance, Victoria said, her voice dropping into a cold, professional register that masked the storm inside her. Hand your security badge to Chief Briggs. You are suspended indefinitely pending a full investigation into this incident. Chloe gasped, gripping Lily's hand tighter as tears flooded her eyes again. Garrett didn't argue. He didn't plead for his job or explain that he needed the money for Chloe's treatments. He simply stood up, unclipped his silver access badge from his belt, and handed it to the chief. Harrison smirked, a look of profound, arrogant victory on his face. Garrett looked deeply into Victoria's piercing blue eyes, holding her gaze for 3 long, silent seconds. There was no anger in his eyes, only a quiet, disappointing pity that cut through her deeper than any insult could. He turned, picked up Chloe in his arms, and walked past the officers out into the pouring rain, without a coat, completely jobless. Victoria watched him disappear into the darkness. She looked down at her son Leo, who was now calmly holding the toy airplane Garrett had picked up for him. As she turned to leave, her foot brushed against something on the concrete floor where Garrett had been kneeling. She looked down and saw a small, rusted titanium dog tag that had slipped from his pocket. She picked it up, flipping it over in her hand. Engraved on the metal was a top-secret Black Ops military serial number, alongside a title that made her heart stop. Commander Ghost Squadron, Tier 1 Sovereign Command. Victoria's breath hitched. The man she had just fired wasn't a regular mechanic. He was a living military legend whose elite fighter squadron had saved her own father's corporate asset transport in the Middle East a decade ago. The sleek, midnight black interior of Victoria Sterling's luxury transport was completely silent as it broke away from Hangar 3. In the back seat, 5-year-old Leo had fallen into a deep, peaceful sleep, his small hands still tightly gripping the toy airplane Garrett Vance had given him. Victoria sat rigidly beside her son, her fingers tracing the rough raised letters on the rusted titanium dog tag she had found on the concrete floor. She opened her encrypted satellite phone and dialed a private number that few people in the country possessed. The call connected on the first ring. Weston Cole, a high-ranking intelligence liaison at the Department of Defense and a longtime family friend, answered with a crisp tone. Victoria, it's midnight in Seattle. What's brought the Ice Queen out of her boardroom? Weston, I need you to run a military serial number for me, Victoria said, her voice dropping into a tense whisper so she wouldn't wake her son. It's a sovereign command tag, serial code, Alpha 09er Ghost. There was a long, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. The sound of rapid keyboard typing echoed through the speaker, followed by a sudden, sharp intake of breath from Weston. Victoria's heart skipped a beat. Where did you get this tag? Weston's voice had lost all its casual warmth, replaced by a cold, deadly seriousness. Answer me, Victoria. Who has this tag? It belongs to a line mechanic at my private terminal, she replied, her brows furrowing. A man named Garrett Vance. I had him suspended tonight. You did what? Weston let out a dark, disbelieving laugh. Victoria, you didn't just suspend a mechanic. You just insulted a ghost. That serial number belongs to the legendary commander of Ghost Squadron. 10 years ago, when your father's executive transport was shot down over the hostile borders of the Hindu Kush, the corporate board declared him dead. The Pentagon refused to send troops. It was a suicide zone. Victoria gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles turning white. My father never told me the details of his rescue. He only said a private security contractor brought him home. It wasn't a contractor, Weston hissed. It was Garrett Vance and his elite 4-man stealth unit. They dropped into a hot combat zone without satellite support, eliminated an entire insurgent battalion, and carried your father on a makeshift stretcher for 20 miles through a blizzard. Vance took a heavy shrapnel blast to his right shoulder during the extraction, a permanent injury that forced his retirement. He was awarded the Sovereign Star in a closed-door ceremony at the White House. The man is a living lethal weapon, Victoria. And he saved your family's entire empire before you were old enough to run it. Victoria slowly lowered the phone, her breath catching in her throat. She looked down at the rusted metal in her palm. The memories of Garrett's calm, steady eyes when he comforted Leo flashed through her mind. She hadn't just fired an employee. She had humiliated the man who was the sole reason her father was still alive to build Sterling Global Aviation. Meanwhile, across the city in a crumbling brick apartment building on Oak Ridge Avenue, the reality of the civilian world was crashing down on Garrett Vance. The small living room was immaculate, every faded piece of furniture placed with military precision. Garrett sat at the scratched wooden kitchen table under the dim glow of a single overhead bulb. Spread out before him were his remaining financial assets, $340 in cash. Next to the money lay a stark, white envelope from the Mercy Ridge Children's Hospital. It was the monthly invoice for Chloe's specialized pediatric physical therapy, $800, due by the upcoming Tuesday. Garrett closed his eyes, his large, calloused hand rubbing the back of his neck. His right shoulder throbbed violently, the damp storm always aggravating the old shrapnel scars buried deep beneath his skin. He didn't care about the pain. He cared about the math. Without his night shift salary, the apartment rent and the medical bills were an impossible hill to climb. A soft rustle of fabric made him open his eyes. Chloe stood in the doorway of her small bedroom, wearing her oversized pajamas. She was holding her purple crayon, her bottom lip trembling slightly. "Daddy?" she whispered, walking over to him with a slight hesitant limp. "Are we going to lose our home because of me? I saw the angry man at the airport. He said I would go away." Garrett's chest tightened with a fierce protective ache. He stood up, the towering, imposing frame that had terrified international terrorists bending down instantly to accommodate his daughter. He scooped her into his arms, holding her against his chest as if she were the most precious, fragile glass in the world. "Look at me, Chloe," Garrett said, his voice dropping into that deep, unwavering frequency of pure safety. "Look into my eyes." Chloe looked up, her brown eyes searching his face. "Nobody is taking you away, and nobody is taking our home," Garrett murmured, his thumb gently wiping away a stray tear from her cheek. "That man at the airport has a lot of money, but money doesn't make a man strong. Do you know what makes a man strong?" "What?" she whispered. "Protecting the people who can't protect themselves," Garrett said, a quiet smile finally touching his lips. "Your daddy has a lot of friends, and I'm going to find a new job tomorrow morning. A much better one. I promise you. Have I ever broken a promise to you?" Chloe shook her head, burying her face into his neck. "No, Daddy." "Then go back to sleep, sweetheart. I'll be right here." The next afternoon, the sun had cleared the storm, but the tension inside the main terminal building of Aegis Field was suffocating. The grand atrium of the Meridian Terminal was packed with high-profile executives, local media reporters, and investors gathered for the formal signing ceremony of the corporate fleet expansion contract between Harrison Croft's hedge fund and Sterling Global Aviation. Harrison stood near the center podium, dressed in a flawless tailored navy suit, holding a flute of champagne. He was laughing loudly, basking in the attention of the press, treating the terminal like his personal kingdom. Standing a few feet away was Lily Evans, the young intern, who had been forced by management to attend and serve drinks as a public display of submission. Her eyes were red from crying. Suddenly, the glass entrance doors slid open. Garrett Vance walked into the polished marble lobby. He wasn't wearing his uniform anymore. He wore a faded flannel shirt, worn denim jeans, and heavy work boots. Balanced effortlessly over his broad right shoulder was his massive industrial steel toolbox, the property he needed to retrieve after his termination. The room grew quiet as the grease-stained veteran cut through the crowd of elite billionaires, like a wolf walking through a flock of sheep. Harrison Croft's eyes locked onto Garrett, and a cruel, arrogant smirk spread across his face. He held up his hand, signaling the reporters to turn their cameras. Well, look what the rain dragged back into my terminal," Harrison announced loudly, his voice echoing across the marble atrium. "The violent mechanic has returned. What's the matter, Vance? Come to beg the board for your clearance badge back? Or did you finally realize that a peasant like you can't survive 24 hours without my scraps?" The flashes of the media cameras reflected off the polished steel of Garrett Vance's heavy toolbox. The silence in the Meridian terminal was absolute, save for the hum of the climate control and the arrogant echo of Harrison Croft's voice. The wealthy investors and aviation executives watched, some with amused smirks, others with cold indifference, waiting to see how the terminated mechanic would respond to the public degradation. Garrett didn't flinch. He adjusted the weight of the heavy steel box on his broad shoulder, his dark eyes locking onto Harrison with a stillness that made the billionaire's smile falter slightly. "I'm just here to collect my personal property, Mr. Croft," Garrett said, his voice terrifyingly calm, carrying a steady resonance that filled the massive atrium. "I have no business with you." Oh, but I have business with you, Harrison sneered, stepping closer, his expensive leather shoes clicking loudly on the marble. He turned to the gathered reporters, gesturing broadly. Look at this man, a loose cannon, a threat to public safety. He represents the kind of uneducated, violent entitlement that poisons our workforces. He thinks because he wore a uniform, he's above the rules of corporate society. Victoria Sterling stood 20 feet away, her heart hammering against her ribs under her tailored silk blouse. She knew the truth now. She knew the man Harrison was mocking was a highly decorated elite commander who had saved her family's legacy. She opened her mouth to speak, to intervene, but the heavy weight of corporate optics and the multi-million-dollar contract hanging in the balance paralyzed her. If she publicly humiliated Harrison now, the board would revolt. Harrison saw Victoria's hesitation and took it as a green light. He looked down at the industrial steel toolbox in Garrett's grip. You want your property? Let's see what a thief takes when he leaves. With a sudden, vicious swing of his foot, Harrison kicked the heavy toolbox directly out of Garrett's hand. The latch snapped. The box slammed against the pristine white marble floor, bursting open. Dozens of heavy titanium wrenches, specialized aviation gauges, and custom-milled calibrated sockets scattered across the terminal floor, sliding across the polished stone and clattering against the feet of the wealthy onlookers. A few executives let out low chuckles. Lily Evans, the young intern, covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face at the sheer cruelty of the act. Clean it up, mechanic, Harrison whispered, leaning in close, his breath smelling of expensive champagne. Clean up your trash and get out of my sight before I have security drag you out in zip ties. Garrett stood completely still for 3 long seconds. His right shoulder throbbed, a phantom ache from the shrapnel deep in his muscle, but his face remained a mask of unyielding, quiet masculinity. He didn't strike Harrison. He didn't yell. Slowly, deliberately, Garrett dropped to his knees on the marble floor. He began gathering his tools, one by one, his massive, calloused hands moving with precise, methodical discipline. Lily scrambled forward, dropping to her knees to help him, her hands trembling as she grabbed a sliding wrench. I'm so sorry, Mr. Vance, she choked out. I'm so sorry. Garrett gently placed his hand over hers, stopping her. Don't ruin your career for me, Lily, he murmured, his voice incredibly soft, shielding her from the mockery. I've got it. Go stand back. Before Garrett could pick up the next tool, a deep, catastrophic vibration shook the entire structure of the Meridian terminal. The massive 3-story glass windows facing the tarmac rattled violently. A low, thunderous roar, unlike the sound of any normal engine startup, echoed through the concrete foundations of the airport. It wasn't the storm. The sky outside was clear. Everyone in the atrium turned to look through the glass. Out on the private apron, Harrison Croft's vintage customized Learjet was enveloped in a sudden, blinding sheet of orange flame. Harrison had bypassed Victoria's suspension order, paying an unqualified third-party rogue line technician to override the hydraulic safety flag and force an emergency fuel pump ignition to get the aircraft ready for his flight. The high-pressure fuel line, weakened by the microfracture Garrett had warned them about, had completely ruptured under the artificial pressure. A localized fuel explosion tore through the left engine cowling, sending a massive plume of toxic, oily black smoke billowing into the air. The fire immediately spread downward, igniting the primary high-volume aviation fuel hydrant pit directly beneath the terminal's elevated glass VIP walkway. Automated fire alarms began to scream throughout the terminal. Red strobe lights flashed, casting a panicked glow across the terrified faces of the elite crowd. "My plane!" Harrison shouted, his arrogance instantly turning into pathetic, wide-eyed cowardice. "My $30 million aircraft." The crowd in the terminal panicked. Executives threw down their champagne glasses, stampeding toward the main entrance doors in a chaotic rush to escape the smoke that was already being pulled into the ventilation system. The press corps dropped their cameras, fleeing alongside the investors. In the middle of the stampede, a piercing, desperate scream shattered the chaos. "Leo!" Victoria Sterling shrieked, her voice stripping away every ounce of her icy corporate armor. "Leo, where are you?" She turned frantically, her hands clawing through the fleeing crowd. Her 5-year-old son, triggered into a severe sensory meltdown by the sudden blast and the deafening screams of the fire alarms, had broken away from her grip. He had run backward, looking for a quiet place to hide, fleeing straight into the glass-enclosed VIP walkway, the exact corridor now suspended directly above the roaring, burning aviation fuel pit. Through the glass, Victoria saw her son crouched in a corner of the walkway, his arms wrapped around his head, screaming in terror as thick, black, toxic smoke began to pour through the floor vents of the bridge. Suddenly, a loud mechanical clunk echoed. The terminal's automated emergency fail-safe system engaged. The heavy, reinforced fire doors at the entrance of the VIP walkway slammed shut, locking automatically to prevent the fire from spreading into the main terminal. Leo was trapped inside a box of rapidly filling poison gas. "No, no," Victoria screamed, throwing her body against the reinforced steel fire door. She pounded her manicured hands against the metal until her knuckles bled. "Open the door. Somebody override the system. My son is in there." The remaining security guards tried to punch in the override codes, but the fire had already burned through the primary electrical conduits under the tarmac. The digital keypad was dead. The glass of the walkway was beginning to crack from the intense heat rising from the fuel pit below. The airport fire department sirens were audible in the distance, but they were at least 4 minutes away. Leo didn't have 4 minutes. The smoke inside the walkway was becoming so thick the boy's small silhouette was disappearing. Victoria dropped to her knees, completely destroyed, weeping hysterically, her immense wealth and global power utterly useless against the reality of death. While everyone else ran for their lives, Garrett Vance stood up from the floor. He dropped the wrench he was holding. The calm, lethal focus of Commander Vance snapped into place like a visor sliding down. He didn't look at the fire, he looked at the problem. He walked past the weeping billionaires, past the fleeing guards, and marched directly toward the locked fire door where Victoria was collapsed. Victoria's fingers bled as she clawed desperately at the cold, unresponsive steel of the security door. The world-famous CEO, the woman who routinely dictated terms to international conglomerates and moved millions of dollars with a single signature, was gone. In her place was a terrified, weeping mother, reduced to absolute helplessness. The heat radiating through the metal barrier was rising by the second, scorching the tips of her fingers. Inside the smoke-shrouded glass corridor, little Leo's coughs were growing weaker, his small hands pressed flat against the cracking glass panel as the toxic fumes rapidly enveloped him. Harrison Croft was already sprinting toward the secondary emergency exit at the far end of the terminal, shoving past his own injured security guards, completely abandoned by his previous arrogance. The remaining airport staff stood completely paralyzed by the flashing red strobe lights and the deafening wail of the sirens. The automated system had sealed the entire zone to protect the main structure. There was nothing left to do but wait for the municipal fire crews. Then, a heavy, grease-stained hand landed gently but firmly on Victoria's trembling shoulder. "Move back, Miss Sterling," Garrett Vance said. His voice was a stark contrast to the absolute chaos of the burning terminal. It was flat, calm, and deeply grounded, carrying an undeniable frequency of pure authority that instantly bypassed her panic. Victoria looked up through her tear-blurred vision. She saw the faded flannel shirt, the sharp, focused jawline, and the total absence of fear in his dark eyes. Power, money, and her entire corporate empire meant absolutely nothing right now. This man, whom she had stripped of his livelihood just an hour prior to protect a corporate deal, was the only thing standing between her son and a terrible death. "Please," Victoria choked out, her voice stripping away every ounce of her remaining pride as she clutched at the rough fabric of his sleeve. "Save him. Please, Garrett. I'll give you anything. The company, the hangar, whatever you want. Just save my boy." "I don't want your money," Garrett said softly, his eyes locking onto hers for a fraction of a second, providing a sudden, grounding sense of security. "Just watch Chloe." He turned to the side, where Lily Evans was holding a crying Chloe a safe distance away. Garrett gave his daughter a reassuring nod, a silent, unyielding promise that he would be okay, before turning his full attention back to the locked steel barrier. The digital keypad was completely fried, bright orange sparks occasionally jumping from the melted plastic housing. Garrett didn't waste time trying to punch buttons or override software. He knelt down, inspecting the heavy industrial hinges and the base of the metal frame. In his years commanding Ghost Squadron, dealing with structural lockouts in compromised combat infrastructure was textbook survival training. He knew that even the most advanced automated fire doors carried a manual, mechanical high-pressure release bypass line beneath the primary pneumatic seal to allow military rescue crews access during a total power failure. He walked swiftly back to where his tools lay scattered on the marble floor. He bypassed the standard wrenches and grabbed a heavy, hardened steel alignment pry bar and a high-tensile pressure clamp. Returning to the door, he jammed the flat edge of the steel bar directly into the narrow gap between the frame and the pneumatic locking sleeve. His right shoulder immediately flared with a blinding white-hot pain, the old shrapnel injuries from his military days screaming against the sudden immense physical exertion. Garrett ignored the agony, his jaw tightening as he threw his full body weight against the bar, utilizing every ounce of his massive frame. The metal groaned. Victoria watched in breathless awe as the quiet mechanic became a human machine, his muscles straining violently against the industrial steel. The manual hydraulic valve inside the doorframe began to hiss, fighting against his leverage as fluid leaked onto the marble. The toxic black smoke inside the VIP bridge was now thick enough to completely obscure Leo from view. The cracking sounds from the large glass panels overhead grew louder, threatening to shatter and drop the entire structure into the roaring jet fuel fire pit below. "Give me everything you've got, Vance," Garrett muttered to himself, his breathing perfectly regulated, his mind entirely clear under the immense pressure. With a powerful final heave that caused the old scars on his back to pull violently, a loud mechanical snap echoed through the atrium. The heavy steel door cracked open by barely 3 inches, releasing a blast of scorching, bitter smoke into the terminal. The opening was far too narrow for a grown man, and the extreme pneumatic pressure was already fighting to force the door shut again. Garrett didn't hesitate. He grabbed his heavy industrial steel toolbox from the floor and jammed it directly into the gap, wedging it tightly between the door and the frame. The heavy metal box buckled and twisted under the immense pressure of the automated system, but it held the opening open. He looked back at Victoria, his face already covered in soot but his expression entirely steady. "Stay here. Don't let anyone touch this box." Before she could even respond, Garrett took a deep final breath of clean air, dropped down to his stomach, and slid beneath the buckled metal door into the blinding, toxic blackness of the burning corridor. The door creaked violently against the toolbox behind him, the metal groaning as if it were about to crush his only way out. The smoke inside the VIP corridor was a wall of solid black, tasting of burnt synthetic rubber and toxic jet fuel. Garrett kept his face inches from the marble floor, where a sliver of breathable air still remained. His lungs burned, but his mind stayed perfectly icy, functioning with the terrifying clarity of a tactical operator. He didn't look back at the buckled steel door or the jammed toolbox holding his only escape route open. He moved forward on his elbows and knees, his ears filtering out the deafening roar of the fire alarms to listen for one specific sound. A faint, ragged cough came from 20 feet ahead. Garrett accelerated, ignoring the searing heat radiating through the floorboards as the fuel fire raged directly beneath the structural glass. He found Leo curled into a tight ball beneath a melting plastic bench, his small hands still clamped over his ears, his face gray from soot and lack of oxygen. The boy's eyes were glassy, slipping toward unconsciousness. "Hey, buddy," Garrett said. His voice was a low, steady rumble, completely devoid of panic, slicing right through the boy's fading consciousness. "Look at me. It's the plane guy. We're going to get out of here, okay?" Sensing the absolute safety that radiated from the massive man, Leo didn't scream or pull away. With his remaining strength, the child reached out, his tiny arms locking tightly around Garrett's neck. Garrett pulled his own heavy shirt over Leo's head to shield his face from the toxic air, tucked the boy securely against his chest, and turned back toward the exit. Behind him, a massive crack echoed. One of the primary structural support beams of the glass walkway buckled under the extreme heat. The floor beneath them shifted violently, tilting toward the inferno below. Garrett didn't hesitate. He threw his body forward into a hard, desperate crawl, using his left arm to propel himself and his child while his injured right shoulder screamed in agony. He reached the narrow, jammed opening of the fire door just as a section of the glass bridge behind him shattered, dropping into the burning fuel pit in a spectacular cascade of sparks and flame. "Take him!" Garrett roared, shoving Leo through the narrow gap. Victoria was waiting on the other side, her bleeding fingers instantly grabbing her son, pulling him into her arms. She collapsed onto the atrium floor, clutching Leo to her chest, weeping uncontrollably as the boy began to breathe the fresh air, coughing violently but alive. With a final, explosive surge of strength, Garrett wrenched his broad shoulders through the narrow opening. The moment his boots cleared the frame, the industrial steel toolbox jammed in the door gave way under the immense pneumatic pressure. The heavy metal box crumpled like sand, and the reinforced fire door slammed shut with a deafening bang, sealing the raging inferno away. Garrett lay on his back on the cool marble, his chest heaving, his face covered in thick black soot. "Daddy!" Chloe's voice pierced the air as she broke away from Lily, running across the floor and throwing herself onto his chest. Garrett wrapped his massive arms around her, holding her tightly, his breathing finally slowing down. Victoria slowly looked up from her son. The most powerful woman in American aviation was on her knees, her expensive silk blouse stained with charcoal, her eyes red and swollen. She looked at Garrett, then down at Leo, who was already calming down, his small hand resting on Garrett's boot. The realization hit her with a physical weight. All her wealth, her corporate status, and her global influence hadn't been able to buy her child's life. This man's sheer, unyielding courage had. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling, stripping away every ounce of the icy barrier she had spent a lifetime building. "I am so sorry, Garrett. I am so deeply sorry." Before Garrett could respond, the heavy main glass doors of the Meridian terminal burst open, It wasn't just the municipal fire crews. A convoy of 3 black, armored government SUVs tore across the tarmac, their sirens wailing, stopping directly outside the glass atrium. A dozen heavily armed federal aviation marshals and state police officers flooded into the room, led by Chief Jackson Briggs and a tall, imposing man in a pristine military dress uniform adorned with a chest full of highly decorated medals. Harrison Croft, who had been hiding near the rear emergency exits, saw the arrival of the federal authorities and instantly saw an opportunity to shift the blame. He pushed his way past the paramedics, pointing a finger at Garrett. "Officers! Finally!" Harrison shouted, his voice high-pitched and frantic. "Arrest that man right now. He's a rogue employee. He caused a security breach in the hangar, and his negligence with the tools caused my private jet to explode. He put everyone's lives in danger. He's a domestic threat." Chief Briggs walked past Harrison without looking at him. The military official in the dress uniform marched directly past the billionaire hedge fund manager, his heavy boots echoing with perfect precision on the marble floor. He stopped exactly 3 feet in front of Garrett Vance, who was now standing up, holding Chloe's hand. The military official snapped his hand up to his brow, delivering a crisp, flawlessly rigid salute. "Commander Vance," the official announced, his voice booming through the entire terminal atrium. "The Pentagon sends its compliments, sir. We received word of a security situation involving a Tier 1 asset." The entire room went dead silent. The remaining executives, the journalist who had crept back into the lobby, and the airport staff stared in absolute, paralyzing shock. Harrison Croft's jaw dropped, his face turning an ash-gray color as his arms fell limply to his sides. Commander?" he stammered, looking between the highly decorated military official and the grease-stained mechanic in the torn shirt. Victoria Sterling slowly stood up, holding her son's hand, a quiet, profound respect burning in her eyes as she pulled the rusted titanium dog tag from her pocket, holding it out for the entire room to see. "He's not a mechanic, Mr. Croft," Victoria said, her voice dropping into a cold, lethal register that made Harrison wither. "He is Commander Garrett Vance of Ghost Squadron, a recipient of the Sovereign Star, and the man who just saved my son from the disaster your illegal corporate arrogance created." Chief Briggs stepped forward, a set of heavy steel handcuffs hanging from his belt, his eyes locking onto Harrison Croft. "Mr. Croft," Chief Briggs said loudly, so every reporter in the room could hear, "you are under arrest for federal aviation endangerment, bypassing automated security protocols and corporate negligence. Take him away." The flash of a dozen media cameras exploded into the room as the federal marshals grabbed Harrison by the arms, slamming him against a marble pillar before dragging him out in handcuffs. The man who had thought his billions made him untouchable was completely stripped of his power in a matter of seconds, his reputation permanently destroyed on national television. But Garrett didn't look at the cameras. He looked down at Chloe, who was smiling up at him, and then at Victoria, whose icy gaze had completely melted into something raw, real, and deeply emotional. General Bradley Thorne slowly lowered his hand from his brow, his crisp dress uniform a stark contrast to the smoke-blackened terminal. The dozen federal marshals stood at absolute attention behind him, their presence completely freezing the remaining onlookers. The arrogant murmurs of the corporate elite had dissolved into a heavy, respectful silence. "The Pentagon has been monitoring the situation, Commander Vance," General Thorne said, his voice carrying the ironclad weight of a man who had commanded thousands. The moment a Tier 1 sovereign asset was flagged under a fraudulent corporate complaint, the Joint Chiefs authorized immediate intervention. "Your service record remains flawless, sir. The local authorities have been fully briefed on the nature of your true clearance." Garrett Vance adjusted his grip on Chloe's small hand. He looked at the highly decorated general, his expression remaining entirely unreadable. The lethal intensity that had defined him moments ago faded back into his quiet, guarded composure. "Thank you, General," Garrett replied, his voice low and steady. "But I'm retired. I'm just a father trying to take care of his daughter. The uniform is in the past." "A warrior like you never truly retires, Commander," General Thorne said softly, a look of profound respect crossing his weathered face. He looked down at Chloe, offering her a gentle, surprising smile before stepping back. He gave Garrett one final, lingering nod, signaled his marshals, and marched out of the terminal. The heavy glass doors slid shut behind them, leaving the atrium in a stunned, breathless quiet. Chief Jackson Briggs stepped forward next. He looked at the crumpled, melted steel toolbox that Garrett had used to jam the fire doors open. He looked at the grease-stained veteran who had just single-handedly defied an automated structural lockdown to save a child. Chief Briggs unclipped his own master security radio, placing it back on his belt. "I've spent 20 years on this airfield, Mr. Vance," Briggs said, his voice laced with genuine emotion. "I've seen billionaires fly in and out on golden jets, treating this place like their personal playground. But tonight, you showed everyone what a real man looks like. It's an honor to have you on my tarmac. If you ever need anything at all, you call me. Garrett offered a small, appreciative nod. Thank you, Chief. Just make sure the intern is taken care of. Lily Evans stepped out from behind a concrete pillar, her eyes still red from crying. She walked up to Garrett, her hands trembling. Thank you, Mr. Vance. You didn't just save Leo. You stood up for me when nobody else would. You risked your entire life for a stranger. You're not a stranger, Lily, Garrett said, his voice dropping into a warm, comforting frequency. You're a person who deserved respect. Never let anyone make you feel small just because they have a bigger bank account. As Lily walked away, the remaining airport staff and paramedics began to clear the area, ushering the remaining shell-shocked executives toward the secondary exits. The chaotic, blinding flashes of the media cameras faded into the distance as the PR teams locked down the perimeter. The massive three-story atrium grew completely still. The frantic red strobe lights had deactivated, replaced by the soft, steady amber glow of the emergency backup system. The silence between Garrett and Victoria Sterling became profound. Victoria stood a few feet away, clutching 5-year-old Leo against her side. The icy, untouchable CEO of Sterling Global Aviation was entirely gone. Her flawless cashmere coat was discarded on the floor, her tailored silk blouse was stained with soot, and her hair was wild and unstyled. Her hands were still trembling, the physical manifestation of a panic she had never experienced in her highly controlled life. She looked at Garrett, her piercing blue eyes completely raw, filled with a mixture of overwhelming gratitude and deep, burning guilt. She realized that she had possessed everything money could buy: global power, massive fleets, international prestige, except for actual peace. She had spent a fortune on specialists to fix her son's vulnerabilities, yet this man, whom she had treated as a disposable laborer, had provided absolute safety using nothing but his quiet strength. Slowly, Victoria walked toward him. Every step seemed to take an immense amount of effort. She stopped just inches away from his towering frame. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the rusted titanium dog tag she had carried from the hangar. Her hand shook as she held it out to him. "This belongs to you," she whispered, her voice cracking, stripping away the last of her corporate armor. Garrett looked down at the metal tag in her palm. He reached out, his massive, calloused fingers gently brushing against her skin as he took the artifact. The subtle contact caused a visible shiver to pass through Victoria's shoulders. She looked up into his dark eyes, finding no anger, no resentment, and no smug triumph. There was only a calm, grounding steadiness that seemed to absorb her lingering panic. "I didn't know who you were," Victoria said, a tear finally breaking through her soot-stained cheek. "I was trying to protect a contract. I was trying to protect the board's interests. I let an arrogant monster humiliate you because I was afraid of the financial fallout. I almost let my pride destroy the only man who could save my son. You were trying to protect your world, Ms. Sterling," Garrett said softly, his voice a comforting anchor in the empty terminal. "I don't blame you for that. But your world doesn't see the details that matter. A contract can be replaced. A child can't." Victoria lowered her head, a soft, shuddering sob escaping her lips. For the first time in her adult life, she felt completely vulnerable, completely exposed. Yet, standing next to this man, she didn't feel weak. She felt protected. Suddenly, Leo let go of his mother's leg. He walked over to Chloe, who was still standing quietly by Garrett's side. Leo reached into his pocket and pulled out the small toy airplane Garrett had retrieved for him during the storm. He held it out to Chloe, his face split into a small, shy smile. "For you," Leo whispered, his voice calm and entirely free of the sensory overload that usually paralyzed him. "Because your daddy is a superhero." Chloe smiled beautifully, her small brown eyes lighting up as she took the toy airplane. "Thank you, Leo," she said, naturally wrapping her small fingers around his hand. "My daddy always saves the day." Victoria watched the two children, her hand moving to cover her mouth as more tears flowed. She looked back up at Garrett, the profound emotional contrast between them fully settling into her heart. She had spent her life negotiating with men who demanded everything and gave nothing. This man gave everything and demanded nothing. "Mr. Vance," Victoria said, her voice regaining a fraction of its strength, though the emotional warmth remained. "Tomorrow morning, I am calling an emergency meeting of the global board. Harrison Croft's assets are being stripped from this terminal, and his contracts are permanently voided. But that is just the beginning." She stepped even closer, her eyes locking onto his with absolute intensity. "I want to build something new. A dedicated global logistics and tactical security division within Sterling Global Aviation, focused entirely on protecting our personnel and operating under the highest moral standards. I need a leader who cannot be bought, a man who knows how to keep people safe when everything else fails. I want you to head the entire division." Garrett looked at her, the silence stretching between them as the ambient lights cast long shadows across the marble floor. "I'll give you whatever salary you demand," Victoria continued, her hands reaching out instinctively toward him before pausing. "Full medical coverage for Chloe's therapies, flexible hours so you never miss a moment with her, and complete structural independence from the board. You won't answer to them. You will only answer to me." Garrett looked down at his daughter, then looked deeply into Victoria's eyes, sensing the rare, genuine truth behind her proposal. Before he could speak, a sudden, sharp chime echoed from the main terminal entrance, drawing both of their attention back toward the darkness outside. The high-pitched chime at the main entrance was followed by the heavy, rhythmic thud of a carbon fiber orthopedic cane striking the marble. Through the smoky haze of the clearing atrium walked Arthur Sterling. At 62 years old, the founder of Sterling Global Aviation and Victoria's father still carried himself with the immense, absolute gravity of an old-world industrial titan. He had rushed directly from his private estate the moment the news of the tarmac explosion reached his security team. Arthur's sharp gray eyes swept across the ruined terminal, taking in the soot-stained walls, his weeping daughter, and his grandson Leo, who was calmly holding the hand of a young girl. Finally, Arthur's gaze locked onto the towering, broad-shouldered frame of Garrett Vance. Arthur froze. His hand tightened so hard around the handle of his cane that his knuckles turned completely white. The old billionaire dropped the cane entirely, letting it clatter loudly against the marble floor. Tears, completely uncharacteristic of the ruthless founder, filled his eyes. "Commander Vance," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking with a decade of unspeakable gratitude. 10 years late, but I finally get to look the man who carried me out of the Hindu Kush in the eyes." Victoria gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she looked between her father and the quiet mechanic. She knew the story of her father's rescue, but Arthur had never been able to identify the shadow unit that had saved him. The Pentagon had classified the entire operation under a maximum security shroud. Garrett stood steady, his posture respectful but completely level with the older billionaire. "Mr. Sterling," Garrett said, his voice a low, calm rumble. "You look like you're healing well." "I am alive because of you," Arthur said, walking forward with a heavy, emotional stride, completely ignoring his cane. He reached out, his hands grasping Garrett's broad shoulders, his frame trembling slightly. "My daughter told me what you did tonight. You saved my grandson. You risked your life for my family a second time, while we treated you like an ordinary laborer. There are no words in the English language to apologize for how this company has treated you." "You don't owe me an apology, Mr. Sterling," Garrett said quietly, his eyes dropping to Chloe, who was watching the old man with wide, curious eyes. "I was doing my job in the mountains. And tonight, I was just being a father. Any real man would have gone through that door for a child." Arthur wiped his eyes, his old corporate ferocity instantly returning as he turned to face Victoria. "The hedge fund contract with Harrison Croft is completely dead," Arthur commanded, his voice echoing through the empty atrium. "I want our legal team to file a multi-billion-dollar countersuit for corporate sabotage and malicious endangerment by sunrise. We will strip Croft of every asset he owns." He turned back to Garrett, his expression softening into a deep, profound warmth. "But more importantly, my daughter's offer stands. The global board will ratify the creation of the Tactical Security and Logistics Division by tomorrow afternoon. You will have absolute authority, Commander Vance. Name your terms." Garrett looked at Victoria. She was standing perfectly still, her piercing blue eyes locking onto his with an intense, silent pleading. The icy, unyielding CEO had completely vanished, replaced by a woman who was offering him her complete trust, her safety, and her heart. "I have 3 conditions," Garrett said, his voice echoing with an undeniable, quiet masculinity. "Name them," Victoria said instantly, stepping closer to him, her hands still trembling slightly from the emotional gravity of the moment. "First, Lily Evans is given a full corporate scholarship to our aviation management program and a permanent seat in ground operations," Garrett said. "She shouldn't have to fear for her livelihood just for doing her job." "Done," Victoria replied without a second of hesitation. "Second," Garrett continued, his arm wrapping protectively around his daughter's shoulders. "My hours must remain entirely flexible. My daughter comes before this company. If she has a doctor's appointment, a dance recital, or a bad day, I am gone. No board meetings override her." Victoria looked down at Chloe, a soft, rare smile breaking through her soot-stained face. "Commander, your daughter is the guest of honor at this company from this day forward. Your schedule will be entirely your own. What is your third condition?" Garrett looked down at his own grease-stained hands. "I don't want a corporate office. I don't want a suit. I belong on the tarmac, where the real work happens. I will train your security personnel, and I will oversee the safety of every single hangar, but I do it as a working man." Victoria let out a soft, emotional laugh, her eyes shining with a profound admiration that cut deeper than any corporate victory. You can wear whatever you want, Garrett. Just help me keep this world safe. Arthur smiled, stepping back to allow his daughter to handle the final details. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek black corporate tablet, handing it to Victoria. She tapped the screen twice, activating an encrypted high-tier financial transfer wire. "Mr. Vance," Victoria said softly, her voice dropping into an intimate, warm frequency that was meant only for him. "I took the liberty of contacting the administrators at Mercy Ridge Children's Hospital while we were waiting for the fire crews. The outstanding medical invoices for Chloe's pediatric physical therapies have been paid in full. In fact, Sterling Global has established a permanent multi-million-dollar medical trust in Chloe's name. Every treatment, every specialist, and every piece of care she will ever need for the rest of her life is completely covered. You will never have to worry about a medical bill again." Garrett froze. For the first time throughout the entire harrowing night, his stoic, unyielding face cracked. A deep, emotional breath escaped his chest, his broad shoulders dropping as the crushing, agonizing weight of financial survival was permanently lifted from his back. He looked down at Chloe, his eyes misting over with a father's profound, overwhelming relief. "Thank you, Victoria," Garrett whispered, using her first name for the very first time. The emotional chemistry between them hung in the warm air of the terminal, a silent, powerful bond forged through fire and survival. It wasn't a forced corporate romance. It was the natural, deep attraction of two opposites, finding a perfect grounding balance in each other. Victoria possessed everything money could buy, but Garrett gave her the one thing her wealth could never secure: absolute safety and emotional peace. 1 month later, the morning sun broke beautifully over Aegis Field, painting the clear blue sky in brilliant shades of gold and amber. Hangar 3 had been completely rebuilt, transformed into a state-of-the-art facility, featuring the highest levels of automated safety engineering in the country. Near the main entrance of the hangar, a small, polished titanium plaque was mounted to the brickwork, engraved with a simple quote: "True strength is not measured by wealth or power, but by the courage to protect those who cannot protect themselves." Out on the pristine concrete apron, 6-year-old Chloe was running through the warm grass beside the tarmac, her slight limp nearly imperceptible after a month of elite medical therapy. She was laughing loudly, her small face radiant with joy as she chased 5-year-old Leo, who was sprinting ahead of her, holding a brand new, customized model of a twin-engine stealth jet. Standing a few yards away, leaning against the polished wing of a newly inspected corporate transport, was Garrett Vance. He wore a crisp, clean, dark blue uniform shirt, with the official insignia of the Tactical Security Division pinned to his chest, but his heavy work boots were still ground-stained, and his hands were still calloused. He looked out at his daughter, his rugged, handsome face filled with an absolute, unshakable contentment. A soft rustle of fabric made him turn his head. Victoria Sterling stepped out onto the tarmac beside him. She wasn't wearing her icy corporate cashmere today. She wore a simple, elegant dark dress, her blonde hair caught in the warm morning breeze. She stood remarkably close to him, her shoulders subtly brushing against his massive upper arm. The contrast between her high society elegance and his quiet, powerful masculinity was breathtaking. "They look happy," Victoria murmured, her eyes tracking Leo, who was laughing more freely than she had ever seen him laugh in his entire life. "He hasn't had a single sensory panic attack since that night at the terminal. He feels safe when you're around, Garrett." "We're all safe now, Victoria," Garrett replied, his voice a deep, comforting anchor as he turned his dark eyes to look down at her. Victoria looked up into his face, her piercing blue eyes melting completely into a warm, emotional gaze that held a clear promise of a shared future. She reached out, her fingers gently sliding over his massive, calloused hand, her grip steady and unyielding. Garrett didn't pull away. He closed his fingers around hers, his quiet strength providing the absolute safety she had spent her whole life searching for. Together, the single father and the powerful CEO watched their children play beneath the endless, open sky, completely ready to face whatever the future held, knowing that as long as they stood together, nothing could ever break them again.